In the years after the end of the Second World War, Jewish young people, of course, were taught that Israel was an absolute necessity for Jews if another Holocaust was to be avoided. And as a teenager, a young man, I accepted this. A member of my family in Israel was a member of a left-wing kibbutz, a Mapam kibbutz, as it then was. And I remember something that my mother told me, that when she asked him, what do you think about the Arabs? Of course, they didn't call the Palestinians, they called them Arabs. And his reply was, a good Arab is a dead Arab. And I just felt so shocked by that. I became fervently pro-Palestine and remain so. My name is Sabby Sagall, and I was born in London in 1937. My parents were Russian Jewish refugees who left Russia in the early 20s and migrated to Danzig, as it then was. When the Nazis occupied Danzig in 1933, my mother left for Britain and settled in London. My father went on to study in Paris, but then also moved to London in around the mid-30s, and I was born here. Of course, these were anxious times. War broke out in 1939. We were in North London, in Shoot Up Hill, during the early part of the Blitz. My parents were then evacuated, the whole family, to Buckinghamshire, away from the bombs. My early life was shrouded in anxiety, because in 1940 it was touch and go whether or not the German army would invade Britain. At home, 3 languages were spoken: Russian, German, and English, because I had a German-Polish nanny. But of course, outside the home, my parents took care not to speak German, as it wasn't the done thing. Of course, in 1940, it was touch and go whether or not the Germans would invade Britain. Had they done so, then I probably wouldn't be sitting here recording this film. My French family had a really narrow escape. When the Germans invaded France in 1940, they moved to the Vichy area. But once the Germans occupied the Vichy area, they were constantly on the run, and they had a miraculous escape. As they were put on a train destined for Auschwitz or another death camp. But because my uncle had connections with French railways, an official got the family off the train and they survived, whereas thousands of French Jewish families perished in the Holocaust. My parents, of course, went to school in Russia, and my father applied to study at Moscow University. This would have been in the mid-20s. And he claimed to have had an interview with Stalin, who at the time was People's Commissar for the Nationalities, because my father said that there was a pre-revolutionary rule that barred Jews from entering certain universities. And he claimed to have had an interview with Stalin, who signed a piece of paper granting him admission to the university. After the end of the Second World War, in the months and years after 1945, we became gradually aware of the extent of the catastrophe represented by the Holocaust. The fact that 6 million Jews had died in the gas chambers. Of course, this became a powerful ideological basis for the Zionist movement in Britain and internationally. As a boy growing up in my Jewish family, I had a blue box, which was the Jewish National Fund box, and you had to put some of your pocket money every week in the box, and the money would go to create and build Jewish settlements in Palestine. My father was a prominent British Zionist. leading Zionists were frequent visitors to my parents' home. At the age of 9, my father took me to the Dorchester Hotel facing Hyde Park, and he introduced me to a man called Chaim Weizmann, who then became the first president of Israel. Also, my father was a close friend of Moshe Sharet, who was the foreign minister of Israel and even for 1 year was prime minister. My first wife was an Israeli, and I was married in Israel, and Moshe Sharet was a guest at the wedding. When the 1967 war broke out, I had an initial knee-jerk reaction, worrying what might happen to the Jews living in Israel. But at around the same time, I met a man called Tony Cliff, who described himself as a Palestinian Jew. He was born in Palestine before the State of Israel was set up, so he wasn't technically an Israeli, but he was an anti-Zionist Jewish expatriate. He talked to myself and other young Jewish students at the LSE at the time, around 1967-68, putting us all straight as to the racist, pro-imperialist nature of the State of Israel. And he said that Israel could not be defeated in a straight military fight between two nationalities, if you like, that Israel would always be defended to the hilt by Western imperialist forces, that Israel was necessary to the imperialist interests in the Middle East, and that the only way that Palestine could be liberated was through the united mass action from below of the people of the Arab peoples throughout the Middle East. So at that point, I became an anti-Zionist in 1967. It was an important turning point, not just for myself, but for my Jewish friends, fellow students, comrades. You know, all of us had illusions in Israel and had been brought up in this way to believe that Israel was an absolute necessity if the Jews were to survive. In the late 60s, 1968, and in subsequent years, I met other Israeli anti-Zionist expatriates who had founded the anti-Zionist Israeli party Matzpen. And I'm thinking of people like Moshe Machover, Akiva Or, Chaim Breshit. Moshe and Chaim Breshit continue to be an invaluable source of information and inspiration about pro-Palestine activities and what is happening to Palestinians suffering discrimination if they're citizens of Israel and suffering brutal occupation in the occupied territories. I think another breaking point, a crucial breaking point, was the Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. The brutal bombardment of not just the Palestine Liberation Organization, but a number of civilians were killed, and that was followed by Israel's masterminding a massacre of Palestinian refugees. I don't think figures vary, from several hundred to 3,500 Palestinian refugees in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. The actual perpetrators of the massacre were the far-right Lebanese Christian Maronite phalangists. But it was evident from the beginning and has been so ever since that the massacre was masterminded, was planned and organized by Israel, by the Israeli army. So thousands were killed. I think that massacre, the brutal bombardment of Beirut, had a crucial effect on many young people who still retained illusions in Israel. Even after the 1967 war. I think from 1982 onwards, it was very difficult to sustain the idea that Israel was a progressive state, let alone a socialist state. I think after that, people realized the extent to which Israel was an oppressive, racist state and society. The young people, progressive young people, had no business consorting with the state of Israel, because in the old days it was customary for idealistic young people to go and spend several months or a year on an Israeli kibbutz. That came to an end after 1982, and of course since then what the norm has changed, and now idealistic progressive young people spend a year on a Palestinian village. Palestinian uprisings were very influential, very inspiring. There was one in 1987 when Palestinians were involved in mass strikes. And there was the Second Intifada, which I think was in 2002. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign had been somewhat dormant before the Second Intifada, so a few of us set up the Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Jeremy Corbyn was one of our supporters, one of our sponsors. He arranged a launch meeting at the House of Commons. I was one of the speakers, and we did what we could to raise awareness of the plight of the Palestinians, their oppression by the Israeli settler colonial community, highlighting the courage of Palestinians in resisting the Zionist settler colonialists. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem have all labeled Israel an apartheid state. And apartheid, of course, refers to South Africa. But when we compare Israel and South Africa, there is a strong argument for saying that Israel is actually worse than apartheid South Africa, for the simple reason that in South Africa, the black population were super exploited, but they were employed. And because they were employed, they were part of the society, however oppressed and exploited they may have been. In Israel, the Zionist movement has always wanted to exclude the Palestinians, to carry out ethnic cleansing, to occupy their land, to deny them human rights. And therefore there is a strong case, and a number of South African Jewish comrades, for example, have mentioned this, somebody like Ronnie Kasrils. Israel is, in a sense, worse than apartheid South Africa was. Some years ago, it could be said that there were three settler colonial states in existence in the Western world. That was South Africa, Northern Ireland, the Orange State, and Israel. South Africa, of course, abandoned apartheid in the 1990s. The Orange State underwent significant change, so that Catholics acquired political rights, civil rights. Israel is the only one of those three that has remained a settler colonial state that denies basic rights to the majority of Palestinians. There is a strong case for saying that Lord Balfour was an anti-Semite. As Prime Minister in 1905, his government carried out the Aliens Act, which sought to keep Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe out of Britain. In Israel, they think he's a great hero who helped to save the Jews, but in reality this politician was an anti-Semite who should not be given any credit for helping the Jews in any way. Sir Ronald Stores, who was the first British governor of Jerusalem after the British conquered Palestine and drove out the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, he said, "What we need in Palestine is a little Jewish Ulster." In other words, he understood the potential role of Zionist settlers in Palestine who would be subservient to the British state and would carry out the interests of British imperialism in the Middle East, particular oil interests, helping to protect the Suez Canal, the lifeline to India and the rest of the British Empire. So that was how British imperialists saw the future role of a Jewish community in Palestine. They would do the bidding of British imperialist interests. But today, of course, it's the Americans who are the most powerful imperialist force in the world, and it's the Americans who call the shots. They are concerned to fulfill what Israel needs, in terms of military equipment. Israel is remains the most important beneficiary of American both civil and military aid. In the book on genocide, which I published in 2013, there is a definition of genocide by a jurist, a well-known jurist at the time called Raphael Lemkin, and he put forward what became the Geneva Convention's definition of genocide, and he argued that killing is the ultimate means of genocide. He says the one which trumps all others, but it's not its primary meaning. And for Lemkin, and I quote here, genocide, he says, lay in the annihilation of a group's way of life, its social networks, its economic, cultural, and political institutions. If we take that broader definition of genocide, i.e., not only extermination, physical extermination, but we extend it to the cultural and political fields, then while, of course, we can't argue that Israel, the Zionist movement, is guilty of the physical extermination of the Palestinians. The aim of Zionism, as we know, has always been ethnic cleansing. Nevertheless, I think there's a strong argument to say that Israel is guilty of cultural and political genocide. In fact, they've done everything that they could and continue to do everything that they can to destroy Palestinian institutions, cultural institutions. There is a Palestinian Authority now, but it was set up following the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. But it's very much subservient to the Israeli state. It lacks independence. It lacks credibility amongst, I would say, the majority of Palestinians. Culturally, of course, the Israelis do everything they can to prevent the Palestinians from seeing themselves as having their own kind of independent identity. The history of Zionism, and I speak here from experience of my own family, they never regarded the Palestinians as an independent, ethnic group. They were always part of the wider Arab masses, where they were nomadic people wandering without a settled terrain. And of course, this flies completely in the face of historical reality. I remember on one occasion hiring a car and driving to Hebron with a Palestinian guide. And I think my comrade Youssef Asfour might have been with us as well. And we were stopped at an Israeli army checkpoint. And the Israeli soldier knew that there were Palestinians in the car, and they were searched and so on. And then he asked me who I was, and I said I was British and I was Jewish. And he looked at me completely in amazement. What was a Jew driving in a car with Palestinians? And it just again summed up the whole nature of Israel's deep-rooted racism. There are some interesting psychoanalytical aspects of Zionism, I think. One of them is the fantasy of a return to the ideal mother. Israel is the mother who gathers in her dispersed, persecuted children and offers them protection from their persecutors. I think one aspect of this is the fact that the Jews in Israel have to compete with their half-siblings, the Palestinians, who also claim the protection of the same mother. And it's interesting that the word Adamah, which means land, is also the feminine of Adam, which is man in Hebrew. A second psychoanalytical aspect is what has been described as identification with the oppressor. The Israeli state, the Israeli army, the way it behaves towards the Palestinians, the way it has always behaved towards the Palestinians, represents some kind of identification with Jewish oppressors of the past, anti-Semitic oppressors, pogroms in Eastern Europe, the Holocaust, etc. The Israeli state is an oppressive, persecuting state, and I think one explanation of this is the way in which Israel represents the identification of anti-Semitic persecutors of the past. Jacqueline Rose, in her book The Question of Zion, quotes Sarah Roy's description of an Israeli soldier forcing a Palestinian to walk behind a donkey and kiss its behind. She also quotes a Grossman novel in which he describes photographs of a Jewish old man being forced to ride another like a horse. A third defense mechanism is the projection of guilt. Israel is a society ill at ease with itself. I think it's difficult to inflict such harm, such damage on another people without incurring such guilt as human beings. And one way in which Israel deals with this is to project that guilt onto the Palestinians. The late Israeli Premier Menachem Begin used to compare Palestinians to the Nazis, as though they were responsible for the Holocaust. And I think this is what a lot of Israelis do. They see the Palestinians as aggressive, as terrorists, and this is a way of projecting their own guilt so as to assuage themselves. It's their way of dealing with a very difficult psychological problem. Fourthly, Zionism encouraged the Jewish settler colonialists to view their history through the prism of the notion of divine election, the chosen people. And the first Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion famously said, "The Bible is my mandate." And I think this notion of chosenness, divine election, is something that is of great importance. In justifying to Israelis their treatment of the Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing, the occupation and so on. They're entitled to do all those terrible things to the Palestinians because they are chosen. I've started working on a book about the Jewish question, and the starting point is a book by a Belgian Jewish historian called Abraham Leon, which he wrote in 1942 in the shadow of the German occupation of Belgium. In that book, he poses the question why, of all the ancient peoples that inhabited the Middle East, the ancient Babylonians, Persians, Assyrians, Phoenicians, ancient Egyptians, only the Jews have survived into the modern era. And he raises the question why. And the answer he gives in a nutshell is that the Jews were travelers. They were merchants traveling all around the Mediterranean area, to North Africa, then into Spain, selling various goods. That even at the time of the Roman conquest in in the year 70 of the Common Era, a majority of Jews were living outside ancient Palestine. And therefore the Jews survived because they had a strong sense of their role as merchant traders traveling from one country to another, and they developed as a result a kind of international outlook. From that point of view, nationalism, Zionism, Israel is an aberration from the real Jewish tradition of travel, of mercantilism, of internationalism. The late 1980s, a chap called Mordechai Vanunu, who was a technician at the Israeli nuclear, so-called secret nuclear plant in Dimona in the Negev desert, he realized that Israel was, contrary to all formal international agreements, Israel was very advanced in its development of nuclear weapons. And he felt very strongly about this, and he took some photographs, and he left Israel, and he went to Australia initially, where he met a journalist who realized what a bombshell, if you pardon the pun, Vanunu had with him. And the Sunday Times published Vanunu's story. This would have been 87 or 88. Vanunu himself wasn't very careful, and he fell victim to a honey trap. It was an American woman who pretended to bump into Vanunu, who caught his eye, and he was attracted to her, and she said, "Come with me to Italy, to Genoa," I think it was, where I have an apartment there and we can be together, spend time together, and so on. And unfortunately, he went with her. And it was a trap. When they entered this apartment, Israeli secret agents were waiting. They pounced on him, they drugged him, and put him in a big box. And there was an Israeli ship waiting, and he was transported to Israel, prosecuted, and sentenced to 18 years, most of which was spent in solitary confinement. He emerged from prison in 2004. But has since been refused an exit visa. So he's now in a wider prison called the State of Israel. Now, a few of us around CND set up this campaign, the campaign to free Vanunu, in the early 1990s. We had great support from several MPs, mainly from Jeremy Corbyn. But we kept on campaigning. We had this picket outside the Israeli embassy, well, as near as you can get to the Israeli embassy in London, in Kensington High Street, every Saturday. We published regular bulletins, we organised benefits, and it became a cause célèbre. The campaign to free Vanunu became a cause célèbre on the left in this country, with support from anti-nuclear movements in Europe as well. In 2004, a group of us went to Israel to be present when Vanunu was released. Finally, it was good that he was released. The fact is, he remains a prisoner of the State of Israel, and he lives in Jerusalem, and he's under constant police supervision. And so Israel really wants to punish him for the rest of his life. So sadly, Vanunu and the rest of us, I think, when we embarked on this campaign, when we set it up and built it up, we didn't fully realize what we were dealing with, I think, just how vicious and vengeful the State of Israel is. Last year, I published, or Paul Grave Macmillan in New York published my book, Music and Capitalism, the subtitle of which is Melody, Harmony and Rhythm in the Modern World. And the theme of the book is looking at the successive musical styles from the late 17th century onwards up to the Second World War, and looking at the social and political background to those, the development of those political styles, the kind of the historical, if you like, substratum, the historical background that helped to shape those successive political styles. And one theme of the book is, of course, the theme of music as resistance. Art is an element of resistance to the existing social and political world that we inhabit. And we see an example of this, a contemporary example of this, in the case of Palestinian music. Palestinian music that highlights the oppression and the courage and resistance of Palestinians. And I'll read you a short passage, starting off with in 1999. Palestinian scholar Edward Said and Israeli musician Daniel Barenboim founded the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, bringing together young musicians from the Middle East, including Palestine and Israel. It surely counts as an expression of cultural resistance, despite its drawbacks, i.e. Israeli musicians have to do military service. But as an artistic union, it flies directly in the face of the ethnic exclusiveness of the Israeli state. And in Barenboim's book, quote, "Everything is Connected, The Power of Music," there is a chapter entitled A Tale of Two Palestinians, in which he, Barenboim, describes how the lives of two young Palestinians were transformed by music. As a music student in France, Ramzi Abu Redwan, quote, enriched the musical life of the conservatory with Middle East harmonies, unquote. He also created an association to collect money for the musical education of Palestinian children and organized a day of benefit concerts of musicians for Palestine. Salim Aboud Ashkar complained that the only Arab literature included in his Israeli education was either Egyptian or pre-Islamic. Contemporary Palestinian literature would be too politicized and would present the difficult issue of Palestinian identity. However, Palestinian writer Nadine Sayegh describes the recent development of music in the Palestinian territories. Quote, "Many of the musicians emerging in the early noughties did so as an act of resistance against the Israeli occupation, with lyrics attacking the occupiers, the occupying forces, and even the Palestinian Authority. It stirs the imagination of the audience to a possible alternative to their current station in life," unquote. In the 1990s, a group of us paid 2 visits to Gaza, the Gaza Community Mental Health Center, whose director was a marvelous man, a psychiatrist called Dr. Ayad El-Sarraj. One element in the diagnosis and treatment of Palestinians was the treatment of children who were absolutely terrified, not just objectively in terms of the horrific bombardment they were experiencing, but also their anxiety caused by their visible inability of their parents and their families to protect them. Children look up to their parents, the mother and father, to protect them from the outside, from the dangers of the outside world. And Palestinian children experienced this terrible spectacle of their parents not being able to protect them from the constant Israeli onslaught. So the Gaza Mental Health Center devoted a lot of its time and its psychiatric expertise to treating children, mental health victims of constant Israeli onslaught. Anti-Zionist Jews like me have been attacked as self-hating Jews, as anti-Semites, and I think the problem has been real confusion as to what anti-Semitism is and what it isn't. So, for example, if I say Jewish bankers run the world, that is a clear example of anti-Semitism. If I say the Jews have greatly exaggerated the Holocaust, only 500,000 died, not 6 million, that is an example of anti-Semitism, because it suggests that Jews represent this massive conspiracy which has allowed them to distort the history of the Second World War and assert control in all kinds of ways. However, if I say that Israel is a racist apartheid state, that is reality, and I think that therefore it cannot be deemed to be anti-Semitic. The Palestinians show enormous courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. They face not only the racism and hostility of the Israeli state, they are facing the hostility of most Arab governments who don't really care about them and who are only too willing to negotiate treaties with Israel. The hope lies in the Palestinians continuing to struggle, their refusal to accept defeat, their refusal to accept that they are simply a nomadic mass, part of the wider Arab people. The Palestinians, in other words, have their own distinct identity, their own history, and they will refuse to give that up. All of us Palestinian supporters had great hope when the Arab Spring erupted in 2011, starting in Tunisia. The Egyptian President Mubarak was overthrown in a revolution in Egypt, in which the working class carried out an absolutely inspirational act, overthrowing the regime. The Arab Spring, of course, spread right throughout the Arab world, and it gave us great hope that this was at last a movement that had the potential to see the liberation of the Palestinians. In fact, I spoke to my Palestinian friend and comrade Youssef Asfour, who memorably said to me, "The gates of my freedom have been opened." Sadly, our hopes were dashed, and a new era of repression was closed that particular chapter that had offered such hope after so many years of darkness. But we await the emergence of a new movement comparable to the Arab Spring that will have the potential to see the liberation of the Palestinians. I think it's important for socialists to support Palestine because Palestine is the last remaining people that is still under the heel of an occupying force, of an occupying power, in which the majority of the population were expelled and not allowed to return to their homes and villages, in which a large part of the population remains under colonial occupation in the West Bank, and in which those Palestinians who are citizens of Israel remain in most areas of social and political life second-class citizens. Despite tremendous odds, the Palestinians don't have many resources, contrary to the South African black population. They don't have economic power, but they have political power, and they have enormous ideological power, which is the reason for the tremendously important international solidarity movement that's grown up in the last 20, 30 years. Palestinians are not seen as having any kind of independent culture, whereas it's quite clear that, in every field of art and culture, the Palestinians, express themselves very forcefully and, establish themselves as having a very distinct historical and cultural presence in the Middle East, and, they will not be moved. And at some point, because looking far into the future, at some point Israelis will have to recognize that the game is up, that there's no room in the modern world for an ethnically exclusive state, and that the only way forward and the only way that will bring peace is to create a single democratic, secular state in which Jews and Israeli Jews and Palestinians are equal citizens, and in the end, looking far into the future, of course, they become one people. I think a single democratic state would also have to be a socialist state. It's not enough to call it secular, because it would have to minimize or eliminate all inequality and exploitation. As soon as, if you have a society based on the exploitation of labor, then obviously the Palestinians will remain at the bottom of the pile. Whereas if we talk about a socialist state, then we're talking about a state which is based on and aspires to full equality between people of different ethnic backgrounds.
أنا دمي فلسطيني فلسطيني فلسطيني